The air hung heavy with the sticky heat of the marsh. In the distance, the sound of a chainsaw cutting through the hum of mosquitoes pierced the thick silence. The swamp, vast and uninviting, seemed to swallow everything whole, its dark waters reaching for anything unlucky enough to step too close. And there it was, the sound of desperate whimpering, a dog trapped deep in the muck. The first responders, a small group of animal rescuers, waded through the thick underbrush, hearts racing, unsure of what they would find. Time was against them. The mud was alive, sucking at their boots as if trying to pull them under with every step. The sun was low, casting a golden light that seemed almost unreal, but the humidity made the air feel like a heavy blanket, suffocating and sticky. The whimpers grew louder, but it was hard to pinpoint their source. With every footstep, the mud seemed to get thicker, more resistant. The dog's voice was muffled, swallowed by the mire. "Stay with me," one of the rescuers whispered, pushing through. His words just a quiet promise to the dying creature they had not yet found. It was a race against time. The dog's life hung in the balance, buried in the swamp like a forgotten secret. The air felt thick with tension, the kind that presses against your chest, making every breath feel too shallow. And yet, the rescuers knew they had to press on. There was no other choice. For the dog, for their own hearts, there was no turning back. The dense fog hung over the swamp like a dark shroud, clinging to the trees and weighing heavily on the land. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp leaves and the sharp tang of stagnant water. Max's boots sunk deep into the mud with every step, the muck pulling at him, reluctant to let go. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. He could feel it in his bones. The swamp was like a labyrinth, and in its heart, there was a life that needed saving. Max was used to this. The desperation, the heart-pounding rush of knowing a creature was out there in danger. He had rescued enough animals to know how quickly things could go wrong. But the swamp, it was different. It moved, it shifted, and it had a way of sucking you in, making it hard to find your bearings. But today, that's exactly what they had to do. His team, a ragtag group of animal rescuers, trudged behind him, their movements slow and calculated as they navigated the murky terrain. Each step felt like a battle, each breath a struggle against the oppressive heat. Sophie, his assistant, was the first to break the silence. Her voice was barely audible over the low hum of mosquitoes, but it was enough to make Max pause. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her eyes scanning the thick brush ahead. There was something about her tone that caught Max off guard. Her usual optimism was tempered with a quiet urgency. Max nodded, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The faint sound of whimpering reached his ears, distant but unmistakable. The cry of a dog, its voice carrying through the murk, pleading for help. It wasn't just the sound of a dog. It was a desperate plea, something primal, raw. Max's heart skipped a beat. He had heard that cry before, in the deep of the night, when an animal was caught in a trap or drowning or lost. This dog was trapped, and it needed them. Without a word, Max signaled to the team, and they moved forward, their steps more deliberate now. The whimpers grew louder, more frantic, and with each passing moment the urgency inside Max intensified. He couldn't explain why, but there was something different about this one. The sound of the dog's pain cut through the air, sharp and piercing, wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. They reached a clearing, the ground soft and uneven beneath their feet. The light from the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the waterlogged land. There in the distance was the source of the cries. Max's eyes widened. A dog, or what was left of one, lay half buried in the muck. Its fur was matted and heavy, caked in mud that clung to its body like a second skin. The poor creature's eyes were wide with terror, but there was a flicker of hope in them. A silent plea that screamed for rescue. It was impossible to tell how long the dog had been trapped. Its limbs trembled with exhaustion, and the air around it seemed to thicken with the stench of decay. The swamp had claimed this dog, and yet it hadn't let go. Max's heart tightened at the sight, and he motioned for Sophie to approach. The ground around the dog was treacherous, the muck so thick that every step felt like a struggle. Sophie knelt beside the dog, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for its muzzle. The animal flinched, but didn't resist. Its eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was only the dog and the bond forming between them, a silent promise that it wouldn't be abandoned. "We're going to get you out of here," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Max watched, his own throat tight with the weight of the situation. There was no time to waste. The swamp was treacherous, and the dog's life was slipping away with each passing second. He could see the signs of dehydration, the pale gums, the listless eyes. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog anymore. It was about defying the odds and bringing this creature back from the brink of death. Max crouched beside Sophie, his hands carefully working to pull away the thick layers of mud that held the dog in place. It was exhausting work. Every inch of progress felt like an eternity. The dog didn't move, but its breath was shallow, its body barely responsive. Sophie kept murmuring to it, trying to reassure the animal, but Max could see the truth in her eyes. They didn't know how much time they had. With one final, desperate push, Max and Sophie managed to free the dog's front legs. The dog let out a weak whimper, its body twitching in pain, but it was alive. The swamp, however, wasn't going to let them have it without a fight. The ground seemed to shift beneath them, and with a sickening lurch, Max felt his own foot slip, sending him plunging deeper into the mud. "Max!" Sophie cried out, panic creeping into her voice. But Max's focus was fixed. He didn't care about the mud sucking at his body, or the swamp's cold grip around his ankles. He had to save this dog. He had to make it through. He reached out, pulling the dog closer to him with every ounce of strength he had left. The dog's body was fragile, its muscles too weak to help, but Max's determination burned brighter than any fear the swamp could muster. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, they were free. The dog was in their arms, trembling but alive. Max exhaled sharply, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this relief, this overwhelming sense of victory. But it wasn't over yet. The battle for this dog's life had only just begun. Sophie gently cradled the dog's fragile body, her eyes welling up with tears as she looked up at Max. "We did it. We actually did it." Max didn't respond. Instead, he watched the dog's slow, labored breathing, knowing that this was just the beginning of its journey. They had saved it from the swamp, but now they had to save it from the weight of its trauma. "We've got a long way to go," Max murmured, his voice filled with quiet determination. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. The truck rumbled over the gravel road, the sound of tires crunching against the uneven surface almost too loud in the small, confined space. Max's knuckles gripped the steering wheel white and tight. His eyes, bloodshot from the fatigue, never strayed from the path ahead. His mind raced, too fast to catch up with itself. The dog, now wrapped in a blanket in the back of the truck, was still unconscious. Its breath was shallow, its heartbeat faint, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over. The air in the cab was thick with tension. Sophie sat beside him, her eyes occasionally flicking back to the dog, her brow furrowed with concern. The silence between them felt like a weight neither could escape. They didn't need to speak. The gravity of the situation was enough. The dog, who had been so close to death just moments ago, now lay on a makeshift bed of blankets in the back of the truck, its body still. Its chest barely rose and fell with each shallow breath, and every now and then a faint tremor ran through its body. Max could hear the faint rustling of the dog's fur against the fabric, a sound that only seemed to highlight how fragile and vulnerable it was. His heart clenched every time he heard it. The rescue had been the easy part. Now, as they raced toward the nearest animal clinic, Max knew that their real challenge had only just begun. The swamp was a deadly place, but the survival of this dog, the creature that had fought so hard to stay alive, depended on them. They couldn't afford to fail now. The headlights of the truck illuminated the dark road ahead, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. The night felt oppressive, like a thick fog that closed in on them with every mile. Time seemed to stretch and distort, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. Max's thoughts were clouded with fear, not for himself but for the dog. Sophie broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "Max, do you think is he going to make it?" Max took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, trying to calm the storm inside him. He couldn't answer her. He wasn't sure himself. The swamp had taken so much from the dog. Its strength, its spirit, its hope. The damage wasn't just physical, it was mental, too. Max could see it in the way the dog had looked at him, wide-eyed, filled with panic. It had known. It had known it was in trouble, and now it was relying on them, relying on him. "I don't know, Sophie, but I won't give up on him," Max said, his voice firm, despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. The truck bounced over a particularly rough stretch of road, jolting Max from his thoughts. Sophie winced and glanced back at the dog again, her face pale with worry. "Do you think we're too late? We've been out there for hours." Max didn't reply immediately. The thought had crossed his mind, too, the possibility that the dog was beyond saving. They were pushing their luck, taking too long to get to the clinic. The dog was in shock, its body was weak, and the trauma from the swamp could have taken more of a toll than they realized. But Max wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't be. The dog deserved a chance, a fighting chance. It had survived the swamp, it could survive this. Sophie reached over, placing a hand on his arm, the contact small but comforting. "We're doing everything we can, Max. We just have to believe that it's enough." Max's gaze softened, but his resolve remained unbroken. Sophie was right, but her words didn't ease the weight of responsibility he felt. This wasn't just a job for him. This wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about redemption. Redemption for every time he had failed to save a life, for every animal he hadn't been able to help, for every moment he had doubted himself. In the back of the truck, the dog shifted, a soft whimper escaping its throat. Max's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but Sophie had already turned back to check on the dog. "Max, I think he's waking up," Sophie said, her voice filled with a quiet relief. But there was still worry in her eyes. The dog's condition was precarious, and even the smallest movement could be a sign of its decline. Max's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal as they neared the clinic. Every second felt like an eternity, each one carrying more weight than the last. He could almost hear the ticking of the clock in his head, a constant reminder that time was running out. As the clinic came into view, a sense of urgency gripped Max. The lights were on inside, a beacon in the dark. The truck's engine sputtered as he parked hastily, his heart pounding in his chest. They were here. The clinic. The dog. It was all happening so fast now. Max opened the door and rushed to the back of the truck, reaching for the dog with gentle hands. Sophie was already there, pulling the dog from the truck as carefully as possible, as though the animal were a fragile piece of glass. The dog was still unconscious, but its breathing had steadied somewhat, though its body remained limp in their arms. Inside the clinic, the vet, Dr. Harris, was waiting. She didn't waste a second. The moment she saw the dog, she motioned for them to lay it on the examination table. Max and Sophie were too shaken to say anything. They had done everything they could. Now it was in the hands of the professionals. Dr. Harris quickly began her assessment, her hands moving expertly over the dog's body. She murmured to herself, checking its pulse and listening to its chest. The quiet buzz of the clinic's lights overhead was the only sound filling the room. Max watched, his throat tight with fear. He felt the weight of the dog's life resting on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were this close. After what felt like hours, Dr. Harris looked up. "He's stable for now. He's weak, but we can treat him." Max exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. There was hope. A small flicker of light in the darkness. But they weren't out of the woods yet. The battle had only just begun, and Max wasn't sure what would come next. But one thing was certain, he would fight for this dog as long as it took. They had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let go now. The hospital lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile glow over the room. Max sat on a hard, uncomfortable chair beside the dog's bed, the silence stretching out between them. The beeping of the machines was a constant reminder that, despite the small victory they'd just won, the dog wasn't safe yet. The fight was far from over. Dr. Harris had been quick to act. She had hooked the dog up to an IV, trying to replenish some of the nutrients and fluids it had lost in the swamp. The faint rhythm of its heartbeat was a small comfort, but Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were treading on thin ice. Each breath the dog took was a fragile promise of life, one that could be taken away in the blink of an eye. Max's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories flooding back of every rescue, every animal he had fought for and lost. The terror of it all seemed so fresh now. He could still feel the weight of those past failures, the crushing sense of helplessness that came with every life they couldn't save. He had promised Sophie earlier that he wouldn't give up. But the truth was, he didn't know how much longer he could keep fighting. The door to the room creaked open, and Sophie stepped inside, her face pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She looked as if she hadn't slept in days. But even in her weariness, there was a quiet determination about her. The dog's life was still hanging in the balance, and neither of them was willing to let go of that thread of hope. Any change? Sophie asked softly, glancing at the dog's fragile form. Max shook his head. No, but he's still with us. That's something. Sophie nodded, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. She took a step closer to the dog, gently reaching out to stroke its matted fur. The dog didn't respond, its eyes closed, its body limp, but there was a subtle shift in its breathing, a sign that it was still alive, still fighting. Max watched Sophie, his gaze lingering on the dog. It was almost surreal, the way the animal lay there, so helpless, so small against the cold, indifferent machines. He couldn't help but wonder about its past, about what had brought it to this point. Had it been abandoned, lost, or had it simply wandered too far into the swamp, unaware of the danger it faced? The thought made his chest tighten. He hated the uncertainty of it all, the not knowing. He had seen so many animals come to him in need, but none had left him feeling this way. This dog, Chance as they decided to call him, was different. He could feel it in his gut. The bond they'd formed, though fleeting, was unlike anything he had experienced. He wanted to see this through. He needed to see this through. Sophie stepped back, her voice breaking the silence. We can't just sit here and wait, Max. There has to be something more we can do. Max nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the dog. I know. But right now, all we can do is give him time. The vet's doing everything she can. Sophie sighed, rubbing a hand over her tired face. I hate just waiting. I hate not knowing. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their shared exhaustion and worry. Max understood exactly how she felt. They were both trapped in a limbo, waiting for something they couldn't control. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, and neither of them knew how to break free of it. They had fought to save this dog from the swamp, but now, in the sterile confines of the clinic, they were fighting a new battle. This one was less tangible. It wasn't just about pulling the dog out of the mud. It was about giving it the chance to heal, to trust again. And that wasn't something they could control. It was a fight they had to hope they could win. Sophie pulled a chair over and sat down beside Max. Her eyes stayed on the dog, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. Max could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words that neither of them could seem to say. The weight of their responsibility felt heavier now than ever before. A soft knock on the door interrupted their thoughts, and Dr. Harris stepped inside, her face tight with concern. I just wanted to give you an update, she said, her voice low. The dog's vitals are stable for now, but there's a significant amount of trauma that we're still trying to assess. Max leaned forward, his heart in his throat. What kind of trauma? The swamp has a way of suffocating things, Dr. Harris explained, glancing down at her notes. The dog's body was in the mud for quite some time. It's likely that it suffered from both dehydration and hypothermia, and it's not clear yet how much damage was done to its internal organs. Max's stomach turned. The thought of the dog's fragile body, battered by the swamp's grip, made him sick. He wanted to scream. He wanted to rail against the unfairness of it all. But there was no time for that. There was only time to act. Dr. Harris continued. I've given him a dose of antibiotics to prevent infection, but we'll need to monitor him closely for the next few hours. I'm not going to lie, it's still a waiting game. Max's mind raced. He could feel the walls closing in. Time, that precious commodity, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to speed it up. The weight of it all, the fear, the uncertainty, pressed down on him like a physical force. "We'll stay here," Sophie said, her voice unwavering. "We're not going anywhere. Not until we know he's going to make it." Max nodded, grateful for her strength. They were in this together. They had to be. As the hours dragged on, Max could feel the time slipping away. It wasn't just the clock that was racing. It was the dog's life, and with every minute, Max felt like he was losing ground. But then, in the quiet of the room, there was a sound, a faint, tremulous whimper. Max's heart lurched. He looked over at the dog, his eyes wide in disbelief. The dog's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and their gazes locked. The smallest shift, the faintest glimmer of hope. But it was enough. For Max, it was everything. The night had stretched on, each minute heavier than the last. The sterile white walls of the clinic seemed to close in around Max as he watched the soft rise and fall of the dog's chest. He sat there in the chair beside the bed, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes never leaving Chance. The whirring of the machines and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above were the only sounds filling the room. And in that quiet, the faintest signs of life, a twitch in the dog's paw, a soft sigh escaping its lips, kept Max grounded, as if the world outside the clinic didn't exist at all. Sophie had left to grab some coffee an hour ago, but Max hadn't moved an inch. His mind was still wrapped around that moment when the dog's eyes had fluttered open. It had been a mere flicker, a moment of fleeting connection that almost felt like a dream. But it was real. The dog was alive. And that small, precious moment had ignited something deep within Max. The faintest hope. He leaned forward in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched Chance's breathing become a bit more steady. The IV lines dripped quietly, the fluids entering the dog's frail body. But Max didn't know how much they would be able to help. The vet had told him that they couldn't be sure of anything until the morning. But the dog's progress, however slight, was enough to make Max's heart race with cautious optimism. He reached out, brushing a strand of fur away from the dog's face, his fingers trembling. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You're not alone anymore. We've got you. You're safe now." Chance's body shifted slightly, a small movement that Max felt in his chest. There was a soft whine, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Max freeze. The dog's eyes, still dull and heavy with exhaustion, shifted toward him. They weren't fully alert yet, but they locked onto Max's face for the briefest of moments. And for that second, Max felt a rush of relief. He didn't know what was going to happen next. The road to recovery would be long, and the dog was still a long way from being out of danger. But this tiny spark was all they needed, a sign that the dog was still fighting, that it wasn't giving up. And Max wasn't going to give up either. Sophie returned a few minutes later, her eyes searching the room for any signs of change. She noticed the way Max was watching the dog, his eyes soft, his posture more relaxed than before. "Anything?" she asked quietly, her voice laced with hope. Max nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. "He moved. He's still here. He's still with us." Sophie's eyes softened, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's something? That's everything," Max replied, his voice barely a whisper. "It's all we need right now." Sophie moved to the other side of the bed, her hands brushing lightly over Chance's body, offering the same gentle reassurance Max had given earlier. She leaned over, her face inches from the dog's, her voice soft as she spoke. "You're going to make it, aren't you? You're going to get better. I know you will." For a moment, the room was still, as if the world outside had faded away. The dog's breathing steadied a little more, and Max and Sophie shared a look. It was a look of understanding, the kind that only those who had been through the trenches together could share. They had been through the worst of it, but they weren't done yet. Max glanced at Sophie, his heart swelling with gratitude for her unshakable resolve. "You know, we've been through a lot of rescues together. But something about this one, I don't know what it is. It's different. I can't explain it." Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes not leaving the dog. I know exactly what you mean. There's something about him. Something that makes you want to fight harder. Max exhaled a heavy sigh, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the bed. Yeah. Maybe it's just because we've seen so much. We've seen how close these animals can get to death. But we also know how strong they can be. You're right, Sophie agreed softly. They're survivors. All of them. The words hung in the air like a prayer. The dog, though still weak, had somehow become a symbol of their own survival. They weren't just fighting for Chance's life. They were fighting for all of the animals they had lost, for every life that had slipped away too soon. This was a redemption story, not just for the dog, but for them, too. The hours passed slowly. The clinic's clock ticked relentlessly, each second echoing through the sterile room. But Max didn't feel the weight of time anymore. His eyes stayed trained on the dog, watching for the smallest signs of improvement, the faintest changes. It was almost as if the dog was keeping time itself, like its progress would determine the fate of everyone in that room. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Chance's eyes opened again. This time, they didn't flicker in and out of focus. They locked onto Max, and for the first time since they'd found him in the swamp, Max saw something. A glimmer of recognition. The dog's tail gave a weak twitch, then another. Max's breath caught in his throat, a tear welling up in his eye. It was the first true sign that the dog wasn't just surviving, it was coming back to life. Sophie gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth. Max, look. Max stood slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The dog's eyes were focused now, a hint of clarity in them. It wasn't much, but it was everything. He stepped closer, his voice trembling. You hear me, buddy? You're going to be okay. You're going to make it. The dog's tail twitched again, more forcefully this time, and a soft whimper escaped its throat. It was weak, but it was there. A sign that it had heard them. A sign that it was still fighting. Max reached down, gently stroking the dog's head. I knew you could do it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I knew you had it in you. The dog let out a soft sigh, its eyes fluttering closed again, but this time it was different. There was no fear in those eyes, only trust. And for Max, that was enough. They had made it through the worst of it. The dog had made it through the swamp, and now it was making its way back to life. As Max stood there, his hand resting gently on the dog's side, he realized that this moment, this quiet, fragile moment of recovery, was the victory they had been fighting for. And in that moment, the world outside the clinic faded away, leaving only the steady, rhythmic sound of the dog's breathing alive. Safe. And, for the first time in a long time, Max allowed himself to believe that they had won. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the blinds, casting a warm, golden glow across the sterile room. Max sat beside the bed, his fingers lightly brushing against the edge of the dog's blanket. The steady beeping of the machines had softened to a comforting rhythm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Max allowed himself to breathe. The dog, Chance, had made it through the night, and though he wasn't fully recovered, the worst was over. Sophie, who had been asleep on the small couch in the corner of the room, stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She sat up slowly, stretching her arms above her head, the tension in her body easing as she took in the sight of the dog. She smiled, her eyes softening as she saw the small signs of improvement. It was subtle, but it was there. Chance was more alert now, his eyes not as dull, his breathing steadier. Morning, Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse from the night spent waiting. Max smiled at her, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes shining with a quiet pride. Morning, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I think he's going to make it. Sophie's smile widened, and she stood, walking over to the bed. She gently stroked the dog's fur, her touch light and tentative, as though she were afraid of breaking the fragile moment they were sharing. Chance's tail twitched at the contact, the smallest sign of recognition. He wasn't quite ready to get up yet, but the signs were clear. The fight was over, and the victory belonged to them all. Max stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the world outside. The sky was a deep shade of blue, the sun climbing higher in the sky. casting light over the green fields stretching out beyond the clinic. It felt like a new day, not just for the world, but for Chance as well. The swamp was behind him now, and ahead lay the possibility of a second chance at life. Sophie joined Max by the window, standing quietly beside him. "You know, I never thought he'd make it," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. "He was so far gone. I didn't think he had anything left." Max nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Neither did I. But there was something about him. I don't know what it was, but I knew we couldn't let him go. He had too much fight in him." Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes brimming with unshaded tears. "I'm glad we didn't give up." Max turned to her, his face serious now, his voice steady. "It's never about giving up, Sophie. Not when they have something to fight for. Not when they still want to live." They stood in silence for a moment, taking in the weight of their words. The bond between them, forged through years of rescuing, of fighting for lives that had no voice, felt stronger than ever. They were a team, and together they had saved this dog. Together they had given him the chance he deserved. In the bed, Chance shifted, a soft groan escaping his throat. His eyes fluttered open once again, and this time they seemed more focused, more aware. He looked at Max and Sophie, his gaze steady, as if to thank them for bringing him back from the edge of death. It wasn't just the physical rescue that mattered. It was the trust they had earned, the bond they had built in the darkest of moments. Max kneeled beside the bed, his face close to Chance's, and gently placed his hand on the dog's head. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to have a good life. A real life." Chance's tail gave a tentative wag, the first real sign of life in days. Max smiled through the tears that threatened to fall. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a rebirth. Chance had found his way back from the swamp, from the brink of death, and now he was ready to move forward. And Max and Sophie would be right there beside him, every step of the way. The door to the clinic opened, and Dr. Harris stepped in, her face illuminated by the soft morning light. "How's our patient doing?" she asked, a warm smile spreading across her face as she took in the sight of Chance, his eyes alert and focused. Max turned to her, his expression one of quiet pride. "I think he's going to make it." Dr. Harris nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at the dog. "He's a fighter, that's for sure. You did good." Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of worry or fear. They were tears of relief, of joy. They had saved him. They had done it. Max took a deep breath, standing tall as he glanced at the dog one more time. He felt the weight of everything. The swamp, the struggle, the pain, lift off his shoulders, replaced by the lightness of hope. "We all did," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet sense of peace. "We all did." And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the world, Max knew that this moment, this small victory, was one that would stay with him forever. Because sometimes saving a life wasn't about the big gestures. It was about the small moments, the quiet victories. And today he had won. Chance had won.